If you have a Bible this morning, open to the book of Job. That's where we'll pick up reading in just a moment. It's one of my favorite songs, The Silence of God. It's about those moments where you ask God why, and you don't get an answer. So we don't always get an answer to the question, why? Life after loss. That is the name of this sermon series that we're beginning today. Sometimes the things that change your life the most, you never saw them coming. They happened like a bolt out of the blue, and it changed your life. And for some, you knew that a loss was coming for years, and it wasn't a matter of if, but a matter of when that loss would come. Everyone experiences loss. It's a part of life. It's a part of living. But there are different kinds of loss. Some losses are kind of part of the natural course of life. They're usually predictable. You know, a child grows into adulthood and they lose the security of home, but they gain the independence of adulthood, being on their own. And their parents lose the relationship with a child at home, but they gain a different kind of relationship with adult children. Or someone gets married and loses the freedom of singleness but gains the intimacy of marriage, right? Those losses are natural. Those losses and gains are a normal part. In many cases, they're even reversible part of life, right? Children can actually end up back in the home dependent on the parents once again. Some of those can be reversed. And what we're really talking about in this series is not that kind of natural and reversible loss. We're talking about in this series a different kind of loss, a kind of loss that occurs less frequently, is more unpredictable, and has far more devastating and irreversible results. And so I thought I would give some examples of the kinds of loss that I've been thinking about and kind of thinking through as I've been kind of writing this series. And examples of those losses would include, say, chronic and terminal illness, a disability of some kind, physical disability, divorce, rape, infertility, miscarriage, abuse, physical, sexual abuse, unemployment, chronic unemployment, financial loss or bankruptcy of some kind, a loss of home, maybe due to a natural disaster or something like that, mental illness, and then, of course, death. So the question is, how do you get through whatever it is that you're going through if you're going through something like this? What do you do when there's nothing you can do? Because for a lot of those things, there's really nothing you can do. But I think it's appropriate to start this series by acknowledging that not everyone is in the same season. Okay, some of what I say will apply to people in some season of loss, but not to others. And this is the nature of loss. It's unique to the individual, even though it's universal to the human experience. Everyone experiences loss, but each loss is different. Everyone is either, headed into a season of loss, or can remember losses they've grieved, or they're going through a season of loss right now. And some may identify with all three of those at once, but everyone's story is different. And you might say, now, Collin, isn't it a little bit of a downer to be spending several weeks on a topic like this in church? I don't want to come to church and feel bummed out, Collin. And I get that, but at the same time, I would say two things. First, God does tremendous things in our lives through the things that hurt the most. He does. God does tremendous things, and it's worth paying attention to those things because God is working through that. And my prayer is that this series is actually hopeful and actually healing for you. And then second thing is this: trusting God with the most difficult parts of life is a huge part of what the Bible is about, right? More than a third of the Psalms are lament psalms. There is an entire book called Lamentations. So singing songs, trusting God with how confusing and how difficult the world is, that is what Scripture models for us. Now, the alternative is to ignore it, to pretend that our losses aren't there, to pretend like everything is happy and okay. And Jesus didn't die so that the church could be a place that pretends that everything is happy and all right. He died to give us hope that on the other side of loss is life. So we don't want to pretend that loss isn't there or that it isn't painful. We want to give you hope in the midst of it. So over the next several weeks, we're going to look at some truths, mostly from the story of Job, and I hope it will help you get through whatever it is that you're going through. And also, some of the truths I think will help us as a church to come alongside, to know how to come alongside other people in their loss, in their times of shock and sorrow. Because we want to be a church, and we strive to be a church that mourns with those who mourn, that bears one another's burdens. And so the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some background on the book of Job. And we're going to dive into the book of Job. And we're going to read about Job's story and Job's losses. And then after all the dust settles, what I want you to see is what happens when Job's buddies show up in this story and after they find out what happened to their friend. And I want you to see what happens there. So what is going on in the book of Job? Well, first of all, the entire book is focused on the suffering of a single individual. And the book of Job is really unique in all of Scripture. There's nothing else quite like it. Because it tells the story of Job, but it's not really a narrative. It's not, we're not given hardly any details or background about Job's life or his family or anything. Because the focus of the book is not really Job's story. The focus of the book is God and suffering. And we're told that Job is a blameless, upright man who honors God. And we're told that at the very beginning of the book. And then all of a sudden, we're taken into the heavenly realms where God is holding court with his staff team, so to speak. And this is a really common image in the Old Testament, describing how God runs the world. And among the heavenly beings, there is a figure called the Satan or the Satan, right? And in Hebrew this means accuser or challenger. And it's almost like we're watching a court scene as this unfolds. God mentions his servant Job, and this is basically God bragging on how great Job is. He's a truly righteous man. Have you considered my servant Job? And then the accuser steps up and challenges God's policy and says, listen, you have a policy of rewarding righteous people like Job. And that's not right, because then the only reason that Job will obey you, God, is because you bless him with prosperity. Of course, Job serves God. He gets something out of it. But let Job suffer. And then we'll see how righteous he actually is. And then God agrees to let the accuser inflict suffering on Job. And this is basically the setup for the entire book, because we're told before we get to the suffering, we're first told these two important facts. This sets up the whole story, right? And if you're going through something this morning, this is important to know before we get to the book of Job, because you might be wondering about in your own situation, is God in control? And the first thing we see in this book is that, yes, God is in control of all that happens to Job. That's the point of the scene in heaven. That God is ruling and God is still God even when terrible things happen. And the second thing we know is that Job is righteous. We hear this from God himself, that Job is righteous. This is super important. You know what this means? Job is not suffering because he has done something wrong. Okay, God is not angry. He delights in Job even. God is not punishing him for some wicked thing he did. And so the entire premise of the book is based on this idea that bad things happen to people, not because they deserve it. That's not how it works. God doesn't run the universe on a point system where every strike against God gets you bad karma. God has ordered the universe in a different way so that under God's current policy and in the current state of this fallen world, bad things just happen to people, regardless of whether or not they deserve it. And those are the things that we have to keep in mind when we hear about Job's loss. And it helps to know those things for us as well. And that is when we find out what happens to Job. Beginning in verse 13, in Job chapter 1, it says this: One day when Job's sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, no, so you have to understand, Job has a lot of sons. He has 7 sons and 3 daughters, okay? A messenger came to Job and said, The oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing nearby, and the Sabaeans attacked and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, "The fire of God fell from the heavens and burned up the sheep and the servants, and I'm the only one who has escaped to tell you." And while he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on your camels and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." And while he was still speaking, yet another messenger came and said, "Your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, when suddenly a mighty wind swept in from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on them, and they are dead. And I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." At this, Job got up and tore his robe and shaved his head. Then he fell to the ground in worship and said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. Now, Job's initial reaction is really amazing. It is incredible. May the name of the Lord be praised. And what we're going to do next week, actually, is we're going to look at that reaction up close, at how that can help us think about our own losses and how revolutionary that idea is. But this week, what I want to look at is what happens just a few verses after this. When Job's friends hear about his suffering and they enter the story, because this is really important for us to get right as a church. I mean, before we get into this series too much, I want to make sure that as a church, we have a culture of love and understanding and care for those who grieve and mourn. We don't always know how to deal with our own losses, and so sometimes it's even harder to know how to respond to shock and the sorrow of others. But honestly, every loss is an opportunity for our church family to draw closer to each other. These are critical moments where we have an opportunity to be there for each other in ways that go beyond normal circumstances. And so this morning, I just want to point out 3 things that happen when Job's friends hear about this loss. So after all of Job's children are killed and his property is ruined, things get worse for Job, if you can imagine it. Because then he is afflicted with this terrible, extremely painful skin condition all over his body. And that is when the news of Job's misfortune reaches his friends. And in Job 2, verse 11, it says this: "When Job's 3 friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, heard about all the troubles that had come upon him, they set out from their homes and met together by agreement to go and sympathize with him and comfort him. When they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him, because they saw how great his suffering was." How can we as a church walk alongside one another in loss? The first thing that Job's friends do when they hear is they get up, they meet together, and they say, "We have got to go and show up for our friend." First thing they do is show up. Our friend is in pain. We're going to sympathize with him. We're going to comfort him. And that is how we should be in our church family. We have to show up. We have to show up for one another in times of sorrow and loss. And we have an excellent example of this, because you know who showed up for us? Jesus Christ showed up for us. Not like he showed up at our house with a casserole or anything like that. That's not what I'm saying. But we believe that God clothed himself in humanity in the person of Jesus in order to sympathize with us, to become like us in our humanity, and to offer on our behalf himself as a sacrifice for all of the evil in the world. In other words, Jesus Christ did not stand aloof from evil and say, "I hope that works out for you." That is not how Jesus dealt with it. He showed up for us. He didn't stand aloof from the evil and brokenness in the world. He took it on himself and he died on the cross. Each of us stands guilty of the wrong and the evil in our own hearts, but God offers us this new start, right? You can see that when Jesus Christ showed up, he showed up to meet our deepest need. That you can have a relationship with your Heavenly Father, and it simply starts by faith. Trust that Jesus really did die for you to save you. That Jesus was showing up to meet your deepest need for forgiveness and salvation. Now, in the midst of what people are going through, we have an opportunity to show up like that and to meet practical needs, and I think we do this well. I think you guys do this well. I think you remember and you do this up to a certain point. I think we do this. But after a month and 6 months and a year, sometimes we forget that the loss doesn't end 2 weeks after or a month after. Right? Some loss is so great that we never get over it. We can only try to get through it months at a time, years at a time. And months and years later, that process is still ongoing. And so what we can do for one another, small reminders, cards, phone calls. I remember a couple of years ago, my grandfather passed away. And when that happened, I just marked on my calendar the date of my grandmother's anniversary. And I thought, that is going to be a hard day this year, especially. And I just thought, you know what? That day, I'm going to mark it on my calendar, and I'm going to call her, and I'm going to check in with her. Now, that doesn't take a lot of doing, but that communicates a tremendous amount of thought and care for one another. And if you do this, God bless you for doing this, because it shows so much love and care for others. These small ways of showing up are a big part of what makes the church feel like a family, feel warm and welcoming and loving. And this is one of the most tangible ways we show love and support for one another. We show up, after a surgery or during an illness or in the aftermath of a divorce, following a miscarriage maybe providing meals, sending cards, asking someone, hey, I'm running to Walmart. Is there anything I can get for you? That's showing up, offering comfort through service. And that's the first thing that I see that Job's friends do. They want to show up for their friend, and then there's something else that they do. And this is really important for us. When they show up and when they get there, people need our tears and our presence more than our words. They show up and they don't say a thing for 7 days and 7 nights. They didn't speak a word. They just offered their tears and their presence to be there with their friend. In fact, the greater the grief, usually the fewer the words needed. When we show up for others, we offer them our presence and the presence of God to be there. We don't offer explanations. We can't. Job's friends just wept aloud. They just cried with him. There was no explanation. In fact, the trouble starts when they start trying to give explanations in the next few chapters. The rest of the book is about them trying to explain what's going on, and they should have never gone there. They should have stuck with the no words and just sitting with him and crying with him. I remember this several years ago. A dear friend, a spiritual kind of father of mine, spiritual brother, spiritual father to me, had his life changed by a single phone call on a random Tuesday morning. Changed his life. His son, who was my age at the time, had been murdered. And he just got a call one morning. And I ran outside to meet him at his truck, and I just hugged him and wept. And he asked me, how do I tell his mother? I didn't have an answer to that. I had only been a pastor for 10 months. I had no idea what to say in that moment. So I just sat there. His wife and his daughter worked at the church, so we sat in a room at the church. And I just cried and was there and was present as he told his wife and his daughter the news. There were no explanations to offer. But my tears meant more than any explanation I could have ever offered. People need our presence more than they need our words. And I'm not saying they don't need our words. Words are fine. But presence is often more important. You might have been in a situation where this kind of came home for you because you couldn't be with someone in their loss. Has that ever happened? It really shows you how meaningful presence is. We have some close, dear friends in Cambridge who tragically lost a child some time ago, and we couldn't be there with them. And all we wanted to do, literally all Candace and I wanted to do, was get on a plane and go and sit and weep with them. And the fact that we couldn't do that made me realize just how important presence is, that nothing can substitute for the presence of an actual person who doesn't offer an explanation, just shows up and shuts up, if you want to say it like that. And when shock and sorrow is weighing on someone, people need our tears and our presence more than our words. And then the third thing is this. The third thing that we see in this story is that they come and they see how great his suffering is. And I want to say this, don't compare. There's this little interesting line. Did you notice this? It says, no one said a word to him because they saw. Because they saw. Because they were observing, they were acknowledging, they were seeing, they were validating how great his loss was. Nobody says, well, at least it's not as bad as this. Don't compare. I remember someone told me once never to say anything that began with the words "at least" during a time of loss. You know, I heard you have cancer, but at least. See, I don't even have to finish the sentence and you're already kind of cringing about that. I heard you lost your job, but at least. No, comparison is never helpful when we're trying to help people, especially in a church context. I feel like sometimes we can get into this thing where, oh, is my loss bigger than your loss? No. Loss is the kind of thing that cannot be compared. Loss is loss. All losses are bad, only bad in different ways. And no two losses are ever the same. Each loss stands unique on its own and inflicts a unique kind of pain. And I want you to think through this, because sometimes we have a tendency to view the pain of others instead of letting it be and instead of acknowledging it. We view it through the lens of our own pain. And I want to give you some perspective, like the friends of Job, to be able to look at someone else's pain and just see it and see the magnitude of it in its own right. So if you think about it, for one person, a loss might be immediate and intense. And one of the best books that I read, one of the most moving books I read on loss, is by a man who was driving in a car with his wife and his 4 children and his mother. And suddenly a drunk driver hit them head on. And it was just, it killed his mother and it killed his wife and it killed his youngest daughter. And so he and his 3 children survived. And he's writing a book about this, and his suffering was immediate. And if you think about it, the consequences of the tragedy were obvious and clear in that moment. The loss just happened in an instant. And then the rest of his journey is trying to live in the aftermath of that moment. And some loss is like that. But you have to understand that not always. Another person might be diagnosed with an incurable disease or cancer, and the loss might be gradual and subtle. And it's not immediate. In fact, it's not even certain. They might not have any idea what's going to happen in the coming months or years. But the life that they once knew is dismantled slowly, not instantly, but just 1 square inch at a time. And the suffering might linger on, and the pain might wear a person down for years. It might cause a person not to be able to work or take care of children. And the illness just looms over everything. So which loss is worse? It's impossible to answer. Loss can't be quantified. Yeah, one person might lose a loved one to an illness or accident, but maybe the relationship they lose was happy and full of joy, and a relationship that they can cherish and celebrate, and their grief is pure and sweet. But some of you know the loss of divorce. And that's different. It's an entirely different kind of loss. You lost a relationship gradually. You might look back on lost years or bitter conflicts or betrayal, on the death of a marriage, and that grief might be full of anger or guilt or regret. The break is not clean, it's messy. Which is worse? Loss is loss. One person might lose a loved one in an accident, but for another, an accident might leave someone with the responsibility to care for a disabled loved one. Disabilities may require years of caregiving and hundreds of thousands of dollars, and problems keep interrupting their lives. Oh, they might grieve their loss while the person is still there. And they might feel regret or resentment because they're faced with exhaustion. So again, which loss is worse? Which pain is greater? The fact is, it's all bad. It's just bad in different ways. And I want to say this. Sometimes when we compare, you know what it does? Sometimes there may be something in your past, and I don't know why we do this, I don't know why you do this, I don't know why I do this, but we all do this. If we're honest, this happens sometimes. There's something in your past where you would say, you know what, Collin? I never actually named that loss, and I never grieved that loss because I was comparing it to someone else's loss, and I thought it probably doesn't even measure up to their loss, so I shouldn't grieve this loss. So there's something back there that you never grieved and you never named it. You know, maybe it was a miscarriage, but it was at 10 weeks. And this person had a miscarriage at 25 weeks, and I just never grieved that. I never named it, never grieved it. Don't compare. It never helps. It never helps. Acknowledge another person's loss, but acknowledge your loss. And when we're trying to walk alongside others, we show up. We offer our tears and our presence, which is often more important than words, and we never compare. We let the person tell their story without comparison. And the thing is, you really get to know someone when you hear their stories of loss, don't you? One of the things I want to do in this series is I kind of want to get to know you. I don't know all of you. I don't know all of your stories. So I want to ask you to tell your story. It's important to share those stories of loss because sharing your story allows you to acknowledge your loss as your own, and it also connects you with others who have experienced loss. And so I want to hear those. I was thinking of a way for you to share stories with me as a part of this series, and I feel like it's going to be important for some people as we talk about grief and loss and what it means to trust God in that. It's going to be important for some people to say, listen, Pastor, I want you to know what my story is and to share it, to acknowledge it. I think it really helps sometimes to put it in writing. So what I did was I created a couple of things. I created a page on the website where if you just go to fbcl.org, at the top you'll see Life After Loss, and you just click there and it'll say send your story to Pastor Collin. And then in the app there's a new tab that just says stories, and it says share your story. And then you choose how you want that story to be shared, or if not at all, you can just share it with me, and that's fine. But as your pastor, I want to know you and where you've been and what's happened. You could write it in a letter and put a stamp on it if you're so inclined, or just drop it by the office, that's fine too. But I want to say thank you for those who will do that. I appreciate that. So what we'll do is over the next couple of weeks, we're going to talk more about this. But before we close, I just want you to know, if you're going through something right now, your loss and your unanswered prayer does not mean that God is absent or uninterested. The truth is that sometimes it feels like God is absent. It feels like God doesn't care. It feels like God is against us. Otherwise, why would this have happened? But God's silence does not mean that he is absent. I never want you to confuse God's apparent absence for apathy. Because at the cross, it seemed like God was absent. At the cross, it seemed like God didn't care about his son, and that was not the case. God sent Jesus to the cross, and Jesus died to show us that God is not absent, that God does care, and that God is for us and with us even when it doesn't feel like it. So let us bear one another's burdens as Christ bore our burden. And may we be a church family that shows up in times of loss to love and serve one another, that offers our empathy and our tears and our presence, and that listens without any comparison. And that is how we shoulder the burden of loss alongside one another. So this week, you show up for someone else. And this week, share your story. Consider telling your story to someone else or to me, and then come back next week, because I promise God's grace is experienced so much deeper in loss than at any other times in life. And I don't want you to miss out on what God has for you next week. Let's pray.